Shabbat Shalom, good Shabbos. Welcome to our cultural program tonight with the City Congregation for Humanistic Judaism. I am delighted to be that you have, I'm going to use metaphors about radio, tuned in tonight while I introduce our speaker, Lisa Napoli, author of Susan Linda, Nina and Cokie, The Extraordinary Story of the Founding Mothers of NPR. And just to clarify, if you don't know NPR, it's National Public Radio. There are probably a few of them who stick to other radio stations. Lisa was born and raised in Brooklyn. We're going to find out what borough soon. I mean, really what part of Brooklyn, and has had a fascinating career in journalism from the New York Times to MSNBC and a lot of things in between. And also I was looking at her bio. Apparently at some time when it was happening, she was covering the Waco hostage standoff. And it maybe at the end, or maybe somewhere squeezed in, we can have Lisa reflect on that coverage in light of last weekend. But right now we're going to forge ahead. So I will introduce Lisa will introduce us to the very, very unique four women of NPR. And just so if you have your scorecard filled out, there's Susan Stamberg, Linda Wertheimer, Nina Totenberg, and Cokie Roberts. Without further ado, I want to welcome a big, hearty New York City, back in town, 18 degrees, where she's in 68 degrees weather in Los Angeles. Welcome to the City Congregation. And as it said, Lisa, Shalom Aleichem, greetings from us.
Shabbat Shalom from downtown Los Angeles. I wish I could show you out my window. It's the best thing about living here. It's a pretty gorgeous view, but I'd rather be where you all are. So thank you for welcoming me. And, I've got to say that the most Jewish of the four women was Cokie Roberts, who was raised by nuns, basically. But that's a whole other story.
Well, you beat me to it. I was going to bring that up because that is the most ironic part. We will explore all things considered tonight.
All things considered, yes. And thank you. I don't know if you're always so dressed up, but thank you for dressing up.
Oh, wow. I sleep in my bow tie. I sleep in a tux, Lisa. I'm always ready to go to a party. But so seriously, just before we start, what part of Brooklyn are you from?
So I was raised, when I was raised there, they didn't call it Kensington, but I was raised, I went to PS 179, Ditmas Junior High School, and then Midwood High School. So my parents moved from East 4th and Avenue C across Coney Island Avenue to Argyle Road, and unfortunately they sold that house a long time ago. Otherwise, wow, they're beautiful houses in Midwood, if you know it, if anybody's there. Maybe somebody's
There are many there. I can see their eyes glistening for the local places. And growing up, and just to transfer into our radio discussion, what radio stations in New York growing up did you love listening to and why?
Oh my goodness. Now I'm showing my age. I used to listen to hard rock. I didn't listen to radio news. My father always went to sleep to WOR. What were the all news stations then? Gosh.
WINS and WCBS.
Yes, and the Nightbird, who was Allison Steele. He would fall asleep to her every night, and he would listen to all the talk show people before everything was 24/7. I'm 58, so this was a long time ago. But he was a news junkie before we called it that, and that's how I got the crazy fever to go into this ridiculous profession. So yeah,
I see where you're stepping off from. Well, ever since the book came out last summer, correct?
Last April, May, around the time
I know it's all a blur.
It's all a blur. Who knows anymore? Well, but around the time NPR turned 50. Yeah.
Right. Many people. Right. It was to coincide with the 50th anniversary of NPR. We'll get to that. But I'm sure a lot of people have been intrigued and become very, very, very aware of through your book about these gifted women you profile, and also the network NPR. And starting off with sort of a question, we're going to slide into it. Regarding these women in NPR, what do you believe, and it's also just detailed in your book, gave them permission and to let them shine at that radio and in that radio network? And I say guardedly, Lisa, let may not be the right word.
Well, no, it was really a lot of it. Most of it was an accident. It was an accident of timing, as many great things and bad things often are. I mean, it was just a confluence of this little network starting up because President Johnson launched the Public Broadcasting Act as in response to fears of commercial broadcasting stranglehold on the American psyche. They were creating public TV and public radio. And that happened around the time of the women's movement. And this little scrappy startup network, radio network they were starting, could only afford to hire the cheapest labor, which of course at that time, well now too, meant women. And these women were young and hungry and willing to work for less. And each of them, I detail in the book how each of them entered the system from 1971 on. And basically seize the moment. You know, anybody here who's worked for a startup knows that all hands on deck, and whoever, you know, pushes themselves to the fore, is willing to work hard, can, you know, usually do really well there. That doesn't mean everybody becomes Susan Stamberg, but it does mean that there's more opportunity than, you know, when you come, if you went into NPR now, it's a huge, enormous place with all these stratifications, and then it wasn't like that at all. It was kind of like, yeah, I'll work extra time, great. You want to work extra time, great. And that's how it all happened.
I'm
but
glad you
much
mentioned.
More interesting than that.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm glad you mentioned scrappy. You know, networks are formed in different ways. CBS, NBC, ABC has its own story, which is another fascinating story, whether Leonard Goldenson break off from the red and blue sell-off and other things. But
Yeah.
NPR, as we know it, as you said, came out scrappy, but it came out of a kind of a surprising origin.
Yes.
From that educational and very small and building.
Yes, yes. And in fact, the book I wrote before this was about Ted Turner and the making of CNN, which I was privileged to be part of in the very earliest days in the base of the World Trade Center. Was where the first CNN New York bureau was, partially because that was all they could afford, and that was sort of marginalized real estate for anybody who remembers 1980. It was a different, you know, nobody liked going to the financial district unless you were part of the financial district. So I wrote a book about the creation of NPR, of CNN, which by the way was launched in an old Jewish country club in Atlanta that had been abandoned. And even though I had worked there for a number of years, I never really understood its history till I wrote the book. So I was enthralled by how these organizations develop. And public broadcasting, even though I'd worked in public broadcasting, I had no idea. And even though I knew, of course, that public broadcasting hadn't always been around, I didn't understand what it had sprouted from, and that it was such a long shot that it would work. It's really a miracle. And what I chronicle in the book is the network's first 12 years and how it almost fell apart just as it was finally building momentum. It's really also a perfect storm moment because radio, and this was a mind-blowing thing for me, even though I was alive in the 70s, radio was transforming in the 1970s. It wasn't just broadcasting, but the satellite changed a lot of things, made CNN and cable, of course, possible because it allowed cable to marry with satellite, but it changed and radio FM really came into its own in the 70s, which is what allowed NPR to become what it did around the country. You know, not everybody's as fortunate as us to live in, and some of you may be from smaller parts of the US or the world, where I wrote a previous book about Bhutan, the Kingdom of Bhutan, and how radio and television were new there 15 years ago. They literally just didn't exist there at all, which is kind of mind-blowing. But in the United States in the 70s, if you lived in Kansas, you couldn't just get the New York Times. It wasn't possible. It was hard. And so if you were driving home or driving anywhere and you could turn on the radio at 5 o'clock and all of a sudden hear an intelligent woman having incredible conversations with newsmakers, wow. I mean, and that's so it really was, and all of these women said it numerous times. It really was a perfect storm of opportunity and technology and an expansion of interest in media. You know, it's also hard for people of a certain age, or even those of us who were around, to remember that the news business, news wasn't something people just consumed. You know, they did it at dinner time, they might read the paper in the morning, but it wasn't something that everybody was plugged into or crazed about, my father being one exception. Um, Anyhow, it was really, and the story is a really fascinating one because you take it so for granted that it's out there now, um, but it
Absolutely.
almost didn't make it.
Now that we have that thumbnail start, it's kind of scrappy. LBJ fed some money to get started. Let's now give a thumbnail description. We have how they. Well, let's see. What would be best here? I think for you, a thumbnail description of each woman, or how they all came together, then backtrack. However you'd like to portray or display this.
Sure. What I also found interesting was that each of these women came into the system, the public radio system, from really radically different backgrounds and interests. You know, today, if you were to look at NPR, everybody there, wherever they're from, pretty much likely grew up wanting to be a journalist, and they might have gotten a master's degree or who knows what in something that equipped them to get into that very competitive system. But these four women were so fascinating and different. I'll start with Susan Stamberg. She was from Manhattan. She grew up on the Upper West Side when it wasn't very fancy. Her father was a salesman. Basically, she got into music and art, which got her into Barnard. She said otherwise she might have gone to Queens College. Not that that was it. She did go to Queens College for a year, but she basically bootstrapped herself out of the working class, which is why I related most to her, because that was my story too, and got to Barnard and basically really wanted to do something in the arts, but women were relegated to secretarial positions. So when she got married, as a young woman, that was what she was doing. She was typing. Linda, and then only because her husband's job took them to Washington, D.C., did she collide with public broadcasting in its earliest forms. She truly is a national treasure and was there at the very, very beginning.
And her name before she married was Levitt, correct?
Yes, Sue Levitt. Yeah.
Sue Levitt, right. She was that informal.
Yes, exactly. And Linda Wertheimer was Linda Cosby. She grew up in Carlsbad, New Mexico, and like Susan, her father was a butcher. So like Susan, she was the first. And I think her parents actually might have gone to some school, some college, but they were what we would call, you know, working class, blue collar folk. And basically, Linda was a star student and got herself out of Carlsbad with a National Merit Scholarship and got to Wellesley. So that completely changed her life. Nina Totenberg is the daughter, probably the best known of all four. Cokie's pretty famous too. Nina Totenberg's father was a famous concert violinist. He left. He was all over Europe. He left before the Holocaust. He got his mother out. And came to the United States basically and made a living, he was fairly renowned before he got here, but once he got here his career really took off. Met a local woman in New York, married her, lived on the Upper West Side, not far from Susan Stamberg for a while. She's a little bit younger than Susan Stamberg, and moved to Westchester. And then Roman Totenberg lived till his early hundreds as a professor up in Boston, as well as, you know, this renowned teacher and performer. And Nina was the only one of these women, well, actually Linda did too, wanted to be a journalist, but really dropped school. She was so interested in being a journalist that she dropped school to get into the business. She does not have a college education, which I think to a lot of people is shocking because you would think that she's a lawyer. And then Cokie came from the most rarefied of the rarefied background. I mean, Nina's background was pretty extraordinary, but Cokie, her father was a congressman, Her mother became a congresswoman. She was a pioneer herself. They were from the South. As I said, she went to Catholic school. She was a devoted Catholic, and she went to Wellesley, where she met a nice boy at Harvard who was from New Jersey, and he happened to be a nice Jewish boy from Harvard. And they almost didn't marry because each of them was so devoted to their own religion. They didn't know how to reconcile both their families' dismay about their marrying, their love, but they didn't want to renounce either religion in order to form a union. And I talk quite a lot about it in the book. They've written quite a lot about it themselves. About how they came to a mutual agreement and raised their family and practiced their faith. But anyway, they're all amazing women.
Lisa, just to hop on that, so much so, one of their books is their shared experience with Passover called Our Haggadah,
Yes.
which I have here. It's a small book, but it really shows and illustrates her devotion, her understanding, and I'll get to whether this, like the other women, what factored in their lives and how they work their backgrounds into some of their ethics and reporting or whatnot. We'll see.
Yes. Steve Roberts called his wife the best Jew in the family. And apparently he had never had a Seder. His family had never had a Seder until he married Cokie. And she had a Seder each year that was apparently renowned in Washington, D.C. So, yes, all fascinating people, and they all came together not exactly at the same time. Linda and Susan were there at the very beginning. Nina came in a few years later. Cokie came in a few years later than that. But really, each one of them entered the place accidentally and could easily have wound up doing all number of other things, as we all could have. But they all got there, and the rest is their history and the network's history, too.
So Lisa, if we call these four women, let's say radio or NPR superheroes, how would you define each of their strength? What is their forte, as well as their what they're known for and what they're really good at? Obviously, Nina Totenberg, Supreme Court coverage, which of course broke a story this week about Gorsuch not wearing a mask because of Sotomayor's health issues, and the Chief Justice said, Sotomayor, you go home and we'll continue on, instead of having, we'll get to that. But that's part of Susan Stamberg Nina still pitching in there.
Yeah, I mean, Nina's gonna, like her dad, be playing till the very end. She is a tenacious reporter. They were all tenacious, and they all dealt with women here who worked in the 70s. I don't have to tell you, they all stood up to a difficult time and refused to be beaten down by the difficult time that women in the workforce faced.
Can you illustrate how bad was it, just to give a taste?
Men, the whole idea of the Me Too movement was unthinkable then. Women routinely were harassed, either verbally or physically, by men, often their superiors in the office. Linda describes being chased around the desk in a congressional office. Each of them had just struggled to even get jobs that were beyond the secretarial, which was something, there's a renowned book by Lynn Povich, I don't know if any of you are aware of it, called When the Good Girls Revolt, about how all the women at Newsweek got together and sued Newsweek because they couldn't in the 70s get jobs beyond the lowest levels. And these women embodied that, in each of their cases. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I just want to clarify something. You're saying someone was chasing her around the table. Are we talking colleagues, supervisors?
A senator.
Okay, a senator. Okay, name names.
Yeah, I'm
talking in general, whether it started at NPR, was it the colleagues or the supervisors or the executives? Who was filtered down or always everywhere?
Oh, well, no, I sorry to be unclear. Basically, women everywhere were subject to all sorts of marginalization and abuse. And there were things that went on at, I mean, I certainly don't know every single thing that went on at NPR, but NPR was different because there were more women there, because women were so cheap to hire. There was a lot of female staffers. They've always had a problem hiring people of color, and there were reports that were done in the 1970s criticizing public broadcasting, not just public radio, for their inability to include people other than mostly white people, which is, ironic, since that's exactly why public broadcasting was set up, to give voice to people other than the people who already had the power of the broadcasting. But women, white women, had a slightly better chance of getting jobs in public radio because there wasn't, you couldn't go to Columbia Journalism School and get a graduate degree in radio journalism as you can now. There was no such thing. So women had an upper hand, not the upper hand, but they had more power in numbers. And these women, recognizing that it was so hard for women elsewhere, as they rose in prominence at the network simply by doing their jobs and doing them well, they banded together and said, we're not going to take this marginalization. And they spoke up. And they spoke up, I mean, I think they would have individually, but the fact that they had one another to speak up was very helpful. The place was started by people who were fairly progressive as we would know it today. Of course, is when we talk about anything, how things were in the 70s is, you talk about it differently than you would now. Like Republicans and Democrats were completely different in the 70s and 80s too, even the 90s. But they all had experienced situations where men equal to them in power, in just all situations, would touch inappropriately, as I say, or just behave inappropriately toward them. I couldn't give any instances of what happened at NPR. NPR was a little bit like CNN in its early days, where there were a lot of young people, there were a lot of affairs, a lot of not even inappropriate affairs, people who were young, just having a wild time. And I've heard stories about various people there, but that's not. I'm going off on a tangent.
Well, let me draw you back. In the back of Lisa's book, she has a wonderful timeline, which really gives you a sense of where things are going, where they're not going, and two citations are just based on what you just said. In December 1970, Women's National Press Club votes to admit men. In January 1971, the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. votes to admit women. This is just 50 years ago. Women's right to vote was 1920. Progress is very much on a slow track when you see this timeline. Right. You'll forgive me. I forget a lot of the specifics of this book. Right now, I'm writing a book about Marian Anderson and the incident of Lincoln Memorial on April 9th, 1939. If any of Don't worry, we'll have you back for that. I can't wait. But yes, so it's a whole different immersion in that world and in the 30s, and for people of color, but yes, the whole National Press Club, actually, interestingly, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom of 1963, the I Have a Dream speech, there was a news conference at the National Press Club, because that's where people went to make news back in those days, and they had a preview of it at the National Press Club, and women couldn't attend. They were relegated to the balcony, and of course, women complained to the NAACP, et cetera, about why is it that you're discriminating, because you're having this march to not discriminate, and you're discriminating against women. So yes, it's a long-standing problem, to say the least. So now, okay, so I don't know if we asked the question, which each women's best attributes. Nina was the Supreme Court, Linda, who tended to do this or enjoy doing this. Can you define what each one is really known for or good at? Well, Susan was the host, and she was not the first host, but she was the defining host. She defined the sound.
if you listen to NPR and you like it, certainly it's very different today than it used to be. But if people fell in love with it in the 70s, it was because it was slower paced. It wasn't this rat-a-tat-tat of all news radio. It was, there was depth. It was more like reading the New Yorker than reading, some tabloid headline, which is what so much broadcasting was even back then. So Susan,
do you have any idea? I'm sorry, but you mentioned about the sound, which is one of my questions, and I apologize to everyone, but also to you. When you said that sound of slowing down, reading copy was, and I don't know if you know this, but did it have anything to do with the choice of microphones or the studio to get that sound?
Well, Susan says that women didn't sound as good in broadcasting because and were often not allowed to be serious broadcasters because of the way the mics transmitted their voices. I've never heard anybody say anything besides Susan about that, and that may very well be true, but it was just that women's voices were not seen as authoritative. And that was seen as a problem. So they're all pioneers in the sense that the idea that they were talking about something other than women's news, fashion or weddings or, fashion or weddings or that cooking, society stuff, that alone was unusual, and NPR couldn't afford to just relegate them to consumer stuff or whatever because they needed smart people to do jobs that they couldn't get men to do. And so each of them came into the system. Susan was a terrific host. She was a born and natural interlocutor. She had a warmth and a style, but people heard her in Kansas. First of all, the heads of NPR were loath to give her that job full time initially because she was a woman. They got some pushback because she was a woman, because a woman hosting a show had never happened. A serious news show had never happened before. They got some pushback because of her New York accent. Read, perhaps she was Jewish. But thankfully, her direct boss, Bill Siemering, who is a MacArthur Genius Grant Award winner for his later work, said, tough. She's the perfect person. She embodies what I want this place to sound like, which is not a newscast, not a news reading situation. But for anybody who's heard Susan, she embodied this warm and reflective sound, an intelligent sound that just didn't exist in commercial radio. There were. I don't mean to diminish everybody who was on television, because it wasn't certainly the schlock that it is today, but no one had ever heard anything like it before. Just to answer your questions too, so we can open up to other people's questions. Linda,
yeah, we'll get that in a minute. I got a couple more, then we'll slide into that.
Linda was very entranced by the Senate and Congress, the machinations of government. Nina didn't just cover the Supreme Court when she first showed up. When she first showed up, she covered everything. Cokie, of course, came in and blew both of them out of the water because she had grown up in Congress and she didn't want to cover Congress. But Linda basically said she has to. She was born in the boiler room. We need her. We need her intelligence and her connections. So let her. So it really, I can't emphasize enough how they all just accidentally kind of found their way in this system. And it was, if you didn't hear it in the 70s, and I certainly haven't heard it exhaustively, they just did whatever came up. They weren't specialists the way we think of reporters now. And there certainly weren't that many. I think, there were 5 reporters when NPR first launched. None of them were women. And it grew, but it didn't grow that much or that fast.
You mentioned that they had a slight regionalism from the New York area. Did this regionalism be perceived as New York or Jewish? Just like you said, Simmering didn't care. He just wanted the right people doing the right job, so to speak.
Well, yeah, he when he hired people, and he hired a lot of the initial 30-something people who worked there, he was just looking for people who would work hard and who got that he didn't want to mimic what commercial broadcasting was doing. And as I say, with Susan, he got some pushback. She was on the air. in a prominent role. So there was a different sort of relationship with the audience has a different relationship, of course, with the host than they do with an individual reporter. I mean, now NPR is famous for having a multiplicity of voices and accents and backgrounds, and it all stems from Bill Simmering, the original programming director, who said that that's what he wanted. It just took a while to get to the point where it is today.
Well, I know we're watching the clock, which is fine. And I have one question, I think, and then we'll bump up the lights and get some response from people. So we not here till midnight because there's so much to do. I'm going to go in a little off the chart. We didn't talk a lot about Cokie, but we did because they all have amazing stories. But I want to reflect in Lisa Phillips' 2006 book, The Public Radio Behind the Voices. Did any of the women react to the chapter called The Fallopian Jungle? Cokie Roberts, Nina Totenberg, Linda Wertheimer. And apparently the title came from a rather disgruntled male staffer. I don't know why Susan Stamberg wasn't mentioned in there. But is there any documentation that they reacted to that chapter title? And I noticed you don't put it in your bibliography. So is that something about Lisa versus Macaulay's book?
Oh, did I not have Lisa Phillips in there? Anyway, that's behind the scenes stuff that other people probably don't want to hear about. But I'll look at that because I read Lisa Phillips' book.
All right, I just thought it was very grating to call it The Fallopian Jungle as a chapter, but it's referring to someone who's bad mouthing. So
right. So I actually wanted to call this book The Fallopian Jungle after that. So that just by way of background, so people understand what we're talking about, the women, especially Susan, Linda, and Nina, who were reporters, Linda, Nina, and Cokie, who were reporters, they shared an office area, not office, but they shared like a cubicle in the back of NPR, just that's where they happened to sit. One man who happened to be a black man, who met a woman. Anyway, he's now a journalism professor. He disparagingly referred to them as the Fallopian Jungle because they were so powerful. If they didn't like somebody who Frank Mankiewicz, the third president of NPR, and extremely famous for a variety of different reasons, Frank Mankiewicz, if he hired someone or was said to be hiring somebody, and the women didn't like that hire, they would make their dismay known. And so this guy, Bill Drummond, said disparagingly, they're the Fallopian Jungle. And to this day, the women all talk about it. I mean, they've given countless interviews where they laugh at it. They're like, well, that guy didn't last. He actually came from print, went there, and then I don't remember exactly where he went after that. But they laughed at it. They laughed at the abuse and the marginalization. They were angry about it, but together ferociously they fought it at this place. Yeah.
Thank you for. That was a really surprise answer. I was anticipating something else, but actually it was a very enlightening answer. So I'm going to say that's my last question. I just want to all remember this is and now they used to always read it every year, but you can get it online, that Mother Stamberg's cranberry relish recipe, which NPR was famous for years and years. If everyone waited for that for Thanksgiving, I think they play it or they just tell you to look it up. So Lisa, I have a question already and I'll start that and we'll get the hands going up. But there was a question about were the four women supportive of each other, or were there factions and rivalries? And if so, what were they?
So the women surprisingly were very, very supportive of each other, to the point where, to literally Cokie's deathbed, they were all there. They all were incredible, especially given how incredibly competitive the profession is today and was then. They just genuinely, it was kismet. They all loved each other. Especially, as I said, Linda, Nina, and Cokie, they would go out to dinner every Saturday night with their husbands. Nina's first husband died. Her second husband was very ill at one point. They all walked each other through life's trials and tribulations like real friends would, not just work friends. So it happened to be an incredible thing that they all worked together, but their friendship translated outside of the workplace, which
sounds like a band of sisters.
They were a band of sisters. Susan was, as I mentioned before, a little bit older, but still they were all very, very tight. There were other women there who apparently they didn't like and who they didn't fight for or support, but they always made a point of helping younger women. At least that was the drill. I mean, I wasn't there. I haven't talked to everybody exhaustively, but there were a couple of women who were their contemporaries in the 70s who annoyed them. But it is an incredible situation. It's incredibly rare, incredibly rare.
Well, thank you very much. Just in case you all remember, Cokie Roberts used to always have Tabasco sauce to pepper any dinner in her small bottle. I'm just representing a big bottle of Tabasco sauce. From Louisiana, everything wanted to be major hot. So I think we'll go around the room, raise your hand, speak up. We'll get some questions going and get the ball rolling. Because I answered Vince's question. Anybody speak up or raise their hand or use the hand?
Jim.
Jim. Okay,
Ryan.
Jim. I see you, Jim. There. Got it. Okay.
First off, thank you for this talk. It's very informative.
Thank you.
You were talking a little bit earlier about regional differences. Would it be safe to say that NPR was the first organization to support the local news support network that ended up coming about years later?
You got broken up there. The local news, what did they support?
The local news initiatives, and the fact that now that people are realizing that there's no local news and that it needs support from as many different sources as possible. Would you say that this was an early effort to try and ensure that local voices would be heard on radio networks?
Sadly, no. What happened in the very early days of NPR, and this is a technology answer, in the early days of NPR, they didn't do what they do now, which is rely on local stations to contribute. You know, if there's something bad that happens in Kansas, just to keep using that, they don't have people in Kansas, so they'll rely on the local affiliates to contribute. The problem was that as public broadcasting ramped up from educational broadcasting, it was just scrappy little stations assigned usually to universities, sometimes to churches or synagogues, but most of the time to universities, where they didn't have real staff. They just basically, it was just a microphone, and it didn't have the professionalism the way so many stations, even in smaller markets, have now. And so Bill Seymour wanted to include voices. He had come from Buffalo, and before that, Wisconsin, and he wanted to include voices from around the nation, as well as a diversity of ethnic and racial, representation. But he had a hard time doing that, in part because back then we didn't have this, and this is like the world's television station in your hand. Back then, to record audio, not only did it require someone with a certain skill and sensibility, but you needed to splice that tape and edit it and then transmit it. And doing that in the first 6-8 years of NPR's existence was impossible, and the stations were ill-equipped for that. They didn't have the people, the people power to do that. So it's a modern construct, the relationship that the network has with the individual stations, and it's very, because you think when you give money to WNYC that you're giving money to NPR, and you're not. You're giving money to NYC. WNYC is paying a subscription fee, a membership fee to NPR to run the NPR shows. And it's a weird, anybody in branding or marketing, it's not a trick at all. It's just how the place is set up. And it is almost not like I say, it's not intentionally confusing, but so what's happened in the last 10 years or so, as newspapers have been tanking for years, right? When I got out of college, that's what I wanted to do, was to work at a newspaper. And when I did finally work at a newspaper, at the New York Times, I worked at the New York Times electronic media company in the late 90s, which was when the web was just starting to bubble up. But the problem is that newspapers, as they've declined, and we've watched it happen rapidly, and been financially in trouble. Again, New York is an outlier because you've got the New York Times, which is, in my mind, the best newspaper in the world, not because I used to live there, I work there. As newspapers in other markets have diminished, they've bumped up the staffs at the public radio stations because the public radio outlets understand the importance of local news. They still don't have the capacity to do the deep reporting. I mean, I look at City Hall in Los Angeles here, and the LA Times, nor our really great public radio stations have the people to bust the corruption that is just so rampant in this major city, because they just don't have people working on it. So yeah, I'm sorry for the answer in the negative. It seems, this week, one of the stations in the public radio stations in Chicago, you may have seen, acquired the Chicago Sun-Times, which has been in faltering condition for years. It was a non-cash deal. They'll come together. Sadly, what ultimately will happen is that everybody will work twice as hard, but nobody will get the time that they need to do the real deep reporting that is necessary to keep in check the bad hombres who are in power all over. So bust the corruption that's all over. So anyway,
Thank you for
Yeah,
that.
it's ongoing.
ongoing.
Yeah. We have a question from Isabel. Did any of the four women receive awards in the field of news radio?
Oh gosh, I'm sure they have. I think a couple of them have won Murrow Awards, but I confess I don't know the litany of many of them. Nina has received, I can't remember how many honorary doctorates, which she always says is ironic since she never finished her undergraduate degree. They've all been celebrated multiple times, many places, but I couldn't tell you exactly all of the
Okay.
accolades.
I'm sure everything from every kind of award available.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Because I have a fill-in question here if we have a moment.
Shirley had her hand up.
Shirley, good. Okay. Shirley, you're on the air. We're doing all the radio lingo
Can
tonight.
you hear me now?
Yes, you're on.
Yeah. I was surprised to hear you say at first that Cokie was the most Jewish of them all, and especially surprised when you mentioned that Robert hadn't, that her husband hadn't ever had a Seder. So,
I was surprised too.
so why was he so insistent on? I mean, they had this problem in the beginning about whose religion they were going to, when he didn't really practice.
I was fascinated by that, and maybe you can explain it to me a little bit better, because it's a cultural versus religious mindset. And his parents had been in the United States for several generations. I can't remember. Well, yeah, it's culture and heritage. Someone's saying, yeah, it was. I mean, they were so deeply disturbed by Cokie that Cokie, whose mother was a devout Catholic, wanted Cokie to get married in a church, and Cokie would not. First of all, had a hard time finding a rabbi who would be part of this ceremony. Had a hard time getting her priest from her parish to agree to marry her outside of the church. And Cokie didn't want to bring her future in-laws, and I believe her future grandfather-in-law, into a church. They did not want to go. And so it was very interesting to me too, that they were culturally Jewish, but not at all, I mean, beyond not at all religious. They just did not practice. Yet the boys, Stephen and his brother, who's named Mark, were twin boys, and they had been bar mitzvahed, but they'd only been bar mitzvahed because they asked to be. They grew up in New Jersey, and they just really, they were in a town that was, I think the way he described it, he wrote a really wonderful, he's written a number of books. He's a very well-regarded journalist himself, Steve Roberts, but he had written a book about his town. It's called My Father's Houses. And he talks about the town and how it was half Jewish and half Polish. I mean, it was a typical New York that moment in time. It wasn't all of anything. And he was in trouble in high school, even if he dated a girl who wasn't Jewish. So
Well,
yeah, I was very intrigued by that.
I can venture or speculate on why that situation existed. And I remember my father-in-law would never enter a church, and he was basically secular as a Jew, but very identifying as a Jew. I mean, the Jews saw the Catholic Church as one of the major sources of creating anti-Semitism, and it was for centuries. So the idea of marrying the enemy was very painful to them.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I mean, when I grew up in Brooklyn, I dated. That makes it sound more formal than it is. I was with a boy from high school whose parents were very upset that he was dating me, or spending time with me. We had no money to go on dates, but and I remember learning that as a young girl. I wasn't even really a woman, but yeah, in their case, it was really intriguing how she actually brought him to a level in his faith and belief that he didn't, I think, believe that he could ever achieve, or would be interested in achieving. And what's very interesting too about Cokie, she had an elder sister who in her own right was a fascinating person who became the mayor of Princeton. And she wanted to marry a Jewish man. Again, I'm sorry, his name escapes me right now. And Peter probably will remember. I'm working
on it.
Yeah, he was fairly well known. But she wanted to marry him, and they couldn't make it work. Hale Boggs, the congressman, their father, or Cokie's and Barbara's father, didn't like the guy, and Barbara said, "Oh, you don't like him because he's Jewish," and he said, "No, I just don't like him." And the truth is that they couldn't come to terms. And I think at the moment in time that they were looking to get married, there was a document, and I am a lapsed Catholic. There was a document that one had to sign in the Catholic faith if you married someone, if you were non-Catholic and you married a Catholic, you had to pledge to raise your children Catholic somehow. And that was the deal breaker for Barbara and her intended.
Absolutely true. I had a friend whose father had to sign that when
Wow.
the parents got married.
Wow. Yeah. And I guess in the subsequent years, really not long afterwards, that rule went away, or was relaxed somehow. So yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, really, they are a fascinating couple. I've watched, you can go to C-SPAN and hear them both talk about it together, because when they were on tour for the Passover book, they did a lot of talking, and they wrote about it, and it's a really interesting facet. It says a lot. I mean, Cokie was going to church for a mainstream media person to talk so openly about her belief. Is pretty huge. But she was going to church. She would go to be on the David Brinkley show, and then go to church afterwards on the way home, which I just found very, very interesting, especially, as I say, since I am not a person who's involved with my faith.
You know, Lisa, you just mentioned about the book tour. When I went to see them speak together, which was absolutely wonderful, Cokie was wandering around in the Tenement Museum. I think she was wandering around, and I went up to her to say hello. I enjoy you. I like you on radio. She said, "Hi, I'm Cokie Roberts," as if we didn't see her, because I felt she's so used to people knowing her voice, they can't identify her. She got used to saying, "Oh, I'm Cokie Roberts. Recognize my voice." I think that's why she did it. And I've never forgotten that. And she was so gracious. And the interview, or the promotion they did together, explored all this you just talked about with the dating and the Seder and all that. So I think we have time for just one more, and then I'm going to give my thanks to Lisa in a second. So do we have another question? And Lisa, by the way, stick around if you want. We'll get to that in a second. Anybody have any questions? Okay. Well, I guess keep listening to radio. It's a great medium. And actually, just 1 second. If you could just really shortly, Lisa, talk to us about covering the Waco, Texas incident. And if you see any parallels as coverage, what happened, what did or didn't regarding what happened in Texas this past weekend. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I will say this, and maybe I should have even steered us to have more of a conversation about this because I know it's on everyone's minds.
Yeah.
I sitting in the field in Waco for something like 6 weeks. I can't remember exactly how long it went on, but I was there from the very beginning until the very end. That and watching the shuttle Challenger explode, which happened a few years before that, convinced me that I was not interested in the news business as it is needs to be practiced. I don't watch television news. I don't listen to the radio. I read a newspaper. I read an old-fashioned newspaper, and I check in online. I've done more of it since COVID, but I basically do not. I am not attuned to the 24/7 news cycle because I think it's toxic. And I think that's why I've written these two books that are historically based. I mean, the book about CNN, I almost couldn't sell because it's not about CNN versus Fox. It's about how this crazy moment in time gave rise, and Ted Turner is a wild character, gave rise to the first cable channel. I can't do it. I can't consume it. So I know what happened last weekend. I won't watch the coverage of those kinds of things, or I mean, of anything, not that thing. I mean, anything. I just cannot watch broadcasting. I find it reductive. I find it incendiary. I want to know in the aftermath what happened. Not watching it develop. And that was the whole, when CNN started in 1980, there was no culture of watching a news event unfold the way we have now. And basically between 1980 and now, we have all become a nation or a planet of people who expect to know instantly when something happens. But really when CNN started, the whole concept was, it used to be that you'd have to wait till a certain time of day to watch the news. Now you don't. But then the people who started CNN said, and it wasn't Ted Turner, it was just his money. He was not engineering the whole operation as people seem to think that he was. And he was also an arch conservative when CNN launched. But the people he hired to create CNN, their mandate was to do serious news. And then when they sat around and said, wait, how do we do serious news 24 hours a day when there isn't always serious news happening?
So with that, I'm sorry, Lisa, with that instantaneous information, are you saying analysis is what you like to read, to if you listen to it or see on TV? Analysis, understanding what had occurred, process, because nothing is really processed as it happens. They keep on saying breaking news, and it keeps on breaking. How much breaking can it go?
Right. The example I give in the book, in the CNN book, is when President Reagan was shot. So I contrast that with when President Kennedy was shot. When President Reagan was shot, it was when CNN was just a year old. And so all the networks did something that if CNN didn't exist, they would not have done in 1981, when CNN had been around for a year now, which is they all went live. And you know what they did? And you can see it all on YouTube. It's all there. They all went live and they all started speculating. The president has been shot. Of course, that's a major, serious instance. Then all of a sudden, ABC had camera footage because they happened to have the camera outside while the president was leaving, giving just a regular speech, and they happened to catch it as he was falling to the ground. But CNN, Bernard Shaw, any of you who remember him, he was a spectacular newsman, and they don't make him like that anymore. He refused to say that somebody had died. Other people leapt to it and said, all kinds of things that were not true. And so I point to that as the day that news became like a sporting event. Although at least even in a sporting event, I know if somebody's, I don't know, sports terminology, but at least there's a certitude when there's a sporting event. But that day, that important day, is a terrible day in American journalistic history. And that said, it's extremely important that we see and know what's going on in the world around us so that we can keep it in check. It's important that we know that a terrible thing happened, like what happened last weekend. But do we need to watch it unfolding? I have no answer to that. But I
The
think that
jury's
watching
out.
it unfolding is not good. It's not good. But like I say,
Folks,
if I knew the answer, I wouldn't write history.
Folks, the book is called Susan, Linda, Nina, and Cokie, The Extraordinary Story of the Founding Mothers of NPR.